welcome aboard.
Please welcome to the stage Axios Energy and Climate Editor, Chuck McCutcheon.
Morning, everyone. I'm Chuck McCutcheon. I'm Axios' Energy and Climate Editor. I edit 2 energy newsletters. One is called Generate. It's a free newsletter that comes out every morning. I strongly suggest you subscribe. It's a good overview of everything that's going on in energy world generally. I also edit a subscription-based newsletter, which is comes out several times a week when Congress is in session and is much more policy focused. Anyway, I'm very excited to be here in New Mexico at this event. It's a homecoming for me. I was a reporter for the Albuquerque Journal for 9 years. I used to live on Guadalupe Street, just a couple blocks away. Really looking forward to discussing what's next for clean energy across New Mexico. And for those in the room, thanks for joining us. And for those who are tuning in via live stream, be sure to follow along using the hashtag Axios Events. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first guest this morning to the Axios stage. She's the newly confirmed Cabinet Secretary of the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. She's someone I've known for a very long time. Secretary Melanie Kenderdine, welcome to Axios. Well, thanks again for being here. Wanted to just start by talking about, what your main priorities are in this job. And you obviously came to the department from having a long career working at several DOE administrations under Presidents Clinton and Obama, and also helped start the Energy Futures Initiative with former Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz. And so, how does your background at those things at DOE and EFI influence what you want to do now?
Let me say first that I was Bill Richardson's chief of staff when he first went to Washington. I actually drove his furniture across the country. That would probably be illegal now, but it wasn't then. And when he got elected to Congress and married his best friend from college, and Bill was on the Energy Committee, and that's what got me my start in energy. And at that point in time, climate change was not an issue, but the environment was a huge issue. Superfund, we spent a lot of time on Superfund amendments, et cetera, et cetera. So the environment and energy production was a huge issue. And then we were very worried about the Middle East and the oil export ban from the pauses and from Saudi Arabia and OPEC, et cetera, et cetera. So that got me interested in energy security as well. So environment and energy security were part of my really first real job. And so that got me started on pathways, which I did take after I married Bill's best friend, lived in New York City for 4.5 years, did celebrity scheduling for the Clinton campaign. It was a weird time in my life. And they asked you, do you want to work for the Clinton administration? And I did. And everyone wanted to work at HHS for Hillary Healthcare. I wanted to work at energy. Okay, so I basically worked at the Department of Energy the entire Clinton administration in various positions, and so that's what gave me my start. I'm hugely dedicated to energy security, energy affordability now, and the energy and the environment, which we call the energy trilemma, and that's what I'm focusing on here as well. So,
Okay.
For New Mexico. So
All right.
I grew up here, so I'm from New Mexico.
So, in a broad sense on energy, I mean, obviously everyone is trying to determine what is happening with the Trump administration on energy and a whole variety of things, and all the things that touch on energy, like tariffs and international trade and so on and so forth. And so, in a broad sense, what effect do what you're seeing out of this administration? How's that influencing what you're doing and what New Mexico's doing on energy?
Well, we don't know yet what the impacts are going to be. I would say that my department, Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources, as you said, which I think is a little bit of a weird name because energy and minerals are natural resources, but energy, minerals, and natural resources in the last year brought in $400 million in federal funds. And so that's a lot of money over the course of the governor's, current governor's administration have brought in $1 billion. That's a lot of money for New Mexico. But so we don't know what is going to happen in this administration, budget reconciliation.
Right.
We were talking backstage about that. We don't know the impacts of the budget. I do know that they're clawing back, trying to claw back some things. I don't know whether that will be upheld by any court, okay, because the Congress has directed that these programs be done. On metals and minerals, the Trump administration has said they support additional metals and minerals mining in the U.S. I gave my first speech on metals and minerals. I was at MIT for 6.5 years in 2009, so I've been paying huge attention. The metals and minerals on the USGS list, they have 50 of them. 33 of them, of those 50, the U.S. is 75 to 100% import dependent. And they are very, very critical for the clean energy transition. And so, in New Mexico, of that, the 33 that were 75 to 100% import dependent on, New Mexico has mined or has actual deposits of 14 of them. So we can play a critical role in the metals and minerals we need for the clean energy transition. I would say one thing, that the mining industry in the United States has had a horrible environmental track record. I had dinner one night in Washington with the CEO of Rio Tinto, had a map showing inactive mining sites. I didn't know whether they were inactive. Did we deplete the resource? Did it become uneconomic? He said they're all Superfund sites. So something I would like to do is develop, and I can tell you what we're going to be doing at MNERD on that would support this development, a LEED-like standard for mines. You walk into a building, there's a LEED certification. That's a carrot, not a stick. It is an enormous differentiator. Buildings are static, mines are active, so you'd have to re-up it every couple of years. But doing something like that, so that states with a lot of these metals and minerals and these resources can move forward without being worried so much about the environmental impacts, I think it would be very helpful. So.
Great. I wanted to get your thoughts on the legislature that just concluded. Obviously, some things made it through, and other things got tinkered with or failed to pass. Can you sort of give your high-level sort of look at, what your assessment of what happened in the legislature?
Well, one thing, and very important for a state like New Mexico, was the passage of a now law that the governor signed, and kudos to her for a lot of her actions on climate change and these issues. But strategic water supply and desalinating brackish water. New Mexico has, in both the southeast and the northwest corners, has tremendous brackish water resources. So desalinating that is very important in general for a state like New Mexico where water resources are scarce, we're in drought, blah, blah, blah. But I would also note that that's very important for power generation. You want to electrify your economy, and I'll get these numbers wrong, but you will know now. MNERD is the acronym for my agency, and I am a nerd. Okay, so that's how I remember. That's how I remember. That's when I first started. How I remembered the acronym. But so for nuclear, you use 4,000 liters of water per megawatt hour. So a lot of water. Concentrated solar uses a lot of water. That's 3,000 liters per megawatt hour. Geothermal, where we are 5th in the nation in geothermal potential. Geothermal, 2,500 liters per megawatt hour. Natural gas is 1,000. Solar PV, 850, and wind, 600. Again, what this suggests to me is that the renewables and the natural gas need to be working together. So, anyway, I think that's a huge issue with what they did in the legislature. They also gave us funding for firefighting and wildfires. MNERD is kind of an interesting combination with my Washington background of the Interior Department and the Energy Department. We have state parks, we have forests, okay, then we have oil and gas and renewables and metals and minerals. And so it's an interesting combination. But there is funding. We've had bad forest fires in New Mexico. You all know the Ruidoso forest fire. Hermit's Peak, that was the worst forest fire we've ever had. I flew over it going to Washington. I couldn't believe it. And so forest fire, some additional funding for fighting forest fires. There's also a community benefits fund, which enables additional investments in innovative technologies, clean energy technologies like the geothermal I mentioned earlier. And so just a few things that came out of this legislature that are very, very important for us meeting the governor's climate goals, which I should have mentioned less than a month after she came into office. She signed an executive order, 45% emissions reductions by 2030. So a lot of what we're doing is very relevant to that. But those are some things that the legislature did that are hugely important and that we're going to move forward on. And I'd say one other thing. When I was in the Obama administration, President Obama instructed the government to do a quadrennial energy review. It was 22 agencies of the government. They have, that interest in what happens in energy, in the energy space. But my office did all the work and the analysis. I had to adjudicate 4,000 comments my last week on the job. Okay, but so we did the QER. We did it in installments. The first installment was energy infrastructure. We didn't want a 1,000-page document that no one read, so we did installments. The next installment was electricity. Then Hillary lost and Trump won, and so we didn't do another installment. I would have done supply chains third, but that was, we had workshops around the country. We had did a workshop in Mexico and one in Canada because we share a lot of energy infrastructure with them, and very well analyzed, coordinated with all the agencies. And 36% of the recommendations in our first installment were either enacted into high-level policy or into law by a Republican Congress. So we're going to do that for New Mexico. We have $2.5 million to do that before the end of the governor's administration in 2026, and we are getting ready to announce the first phase, which is doing the baselining work, and I think because New Mexico, we're second in the nation in oil production, we're fourth in the nation in marketed gas production, seventh in wind. I mentioned fifth in geothermal potential. We have huge clean energy resources. We have huge conventional energy resources. We have an enormous innovation infrastructure in New Mexico with 2 national laboratories. We have a committed governor, committed to the clean energy transition. And what we do in this analysis, I think, could provide a roadmap for the country, and I think, quite frankly, some parts of the world, like Saudi Arabia. You know, I've been there 10 times because you work high levels at DOE, you go to Saudi Arabia a lot, and they have one product, oil. In 2050, they'll have 65 million people. Okay, they need roadmaps like this too. All of the Middle East does, and so I think it could be a very, very important example for the country and roadmap for the world. So
Yeah, well, that is a perfect segue to my last question, which is sort of like looking down the road 5 to 10 years in terms of New Mexico's energy future. You know, what excites you the most?
How we develop and implement the thoughtful, sequenced policies that we get to net zero. And I emphasize sequenced. We are not going to be running the world on wind and solar tomorrow. Okay, and all forecasts in all scenarios you look at, EIA, IEA, they all show declining, but substantial natural gas consumption out to 2050. And New Mexico is no exception. And how we manage that transition and the policies that we develop, how we sequence them, how we crosswalk the skill sets of our oil and gas workers to clean energy technologies, those skill sets, the knowledge of the subsurface, hugely, hugely important for CCS, which I think is critical. For hydrogen, you're storing hydrogen underground. For the geothermal that I mentioned, their pipeline knowledge is hugely important. You need pipelines for hydrogen. You're going to need it for CCS. So crosswalking those skill sets and not threatening their jobs, creating new opportunities for the people who are working in the conventional energy sector over the next 30 years, I think is hugely important. And that's what I'm looking forward to and makes me get up and drive from Albuquerque to Santa Fe every day.
Well, listen, I had mentioned that we were going to have way more to discuss than we had time for, so we're out of time, but we'll have to leave it there. But thanks again, Secretary Kinderine, for joining us this morning on these important issues.
My favorite song.
Oh.
What was the last song I listened to?
What was the last song you listened to? We
Bright Future in Sales by
Fountains of Wayne.
Fountains of Wayne. And I was listening to it this morning coming here because there's a line in Bright Future in Sales which is, I had to do some quick reading for the big meeting, which is what I had to do on my way here. So, okay, so thank you.
All right, thanks again very much.
Thank you.
Introducing our View from the Top moderator, Hope King.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for the applause. I really appreciate it. Good morning. I am Axios' senior, I should say, I'm used to my new title of events moderator and host. I am so excited to be here in Santa Fe. My first time in New Mexico was beautiful, and I can't wait to come back. Thank you all for joining us. A big thank you also to Shell for making today's event possible and for their year-long partnership, taking us to Richmond, Virginia, Baton Rouge, and Washington, D.C. to discuss clean energy and more. I am excited to sit down with and to introduce our next guest for a View from the Top segment, Senior Vice President of Mobility, Americas at Shell, Barbara Stoyko. Thank you for being here. Glad to be here. All right, let's start big picture. As a business leader in this space, this vast space where so much change is happening with EVs and changing fuel demands and consumer habits and preferences, what are the top three things you're looking at right now?
Yeah, great question. So as the Vice President of Mobility and Convenience across North America, we're really focused on retail fueling, right? So retail and convenience gas stations. In the US alone, we have about 12,000 stations across 49 states. And so there's a couple things I would say that are in my top three that really pertain to the conversation we're having today. The first one is around actually something that Secretary Kenderdine mentioned, which is the energy trilemma, which I think is also the way we look at it is an obligation and an aspiration to really provide the motoring community affordable, reliable, and sustainable liquid fuels into the future. So across 49 states, there's a lot of different things happening in different pockets, and things are moving at different paces. So one of our goals is to stay on top of that. We like to think about ourselves as serving the energy user on the go. And so kind of meeting their demands as they come up, which is sometimes legislatively driven, sometimes it's consumer demand driven. So that's probably the first one. The second one is we've recently started, over the last 5 years, an EV business. So interesting to be in a business that is over 100 years old and then starting a new one as well. Actually, I was just thinking about that because we had an event where we were recognizing our top branded wholesalers across the United States, and we actually celebrated an anniversary, 100-year anniversary, not only in the gasoline business, but with Shell in the gasoline business, one of our partners. So think about the maturity and the amount of understanding we have about this ecosystem and the supply chain. And then think about where we are in the EV journey, right? We're really 10, 15 years in. Someday we'll be 100 years in and we'll know a lot more than we do today. But I think the main focus for us right now is really on kind of that reliability for the user, being able to meet their needs, across a number of different use cases. And then the third one is really around, just consumer loyalty. Consumers have a lot of choices these days. And so making sure that we're adapting, especially as people move from ICE vehicles to EV, to continue to provide loyalty solutions for them.
I like the idea that 100 years from now, someone's going to be rewatching our conversation. So I like that image. So zooming in from the big picture to today and where we are, physically and literally, why are we sitting down to have this conversation in Santa Fe? And why is New Mexico important to Shell and to the bigger picture of energy transition?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we've been present in New Mexico for many decades through the Shell brand, of course. We actually are not a producer in the state, so either upstream or downstream. Really, it's our retail presence that we're known for here. We actually recently, last year, we acquired one of our long-standing partners here, Brewer Oil, and so we now have 45 company-operated sites in New Mexico, across all of New Mexico, and we employ 450 people. So, it's a strategic growth market for us. And I think it's a great combination of that. And then here is a state that's really leaning into clean fuel standards and really trying to role model what that could look like. I think it's going to be the starting of something that a lot of other people can learn from.
Let's talk about that. What kind of role model could New Mexico serve? And specifically, what can New Mexico learn from the existing clean fuel standards programs in California, Oregon, and Washington?
Yeah, I think there's several learnings I think we can take. I think it is a combination. Learn from the things that are going well and maybe not so well in some of the other states. And then also think about how we can set the standard for so many other states. There's lots of initiatives underway in discussion across the United States. So this is a great way to start developing kind of something that really can work both for the industry and for the motoring public. I would say there's probably three things I would highlight if we think about what we could learn. The first one, maybe around pace, right? So how can we ensure that the way that we legislate this really allows both technologically and commercially a way through the journey, right? So can we get it done at the pace that we have set for us? Can the industry do it during that period of time? So I think that's an important one. I think it's also important to think about use cases, right? So what works for a commuter here in Santa Fe is going to be way different than what works for someone working in the Permian Basin. What works for a consumer in a passenger vehicle is different than someone that's in road transport. So we need to think through all of those use cases and make sure that we're meeting their needs. And then I would say the last thing is, just watching what's happening in some of the more progressive markets in terms of, on the EV journey. Mm-hmm. If we think about even the most progressive markets, there's still only about 25, maybe 30% of the new car sales are EV cars. and the average car park turns over between 10 and 12 years, right? So if you do the math on that, right, I think we really need to think about not just what the consumer impact is in terms of affordability and reliability in 2026 when the clean fuel standards here would begin, but also 2030 and 2035 as things ramp up. Will that consumer base be able to adapt? Will it be affordable for them? Will there be reliable supply? I think those are all important questions that we can glean some real insights from other states.
And I know that's why Shell's been sort of dual tracking, R&D, but also supporting, of course, existing consumer behaviors and demands. Let's talk more about the how, right? So let's talk about the best ways to implement the clean fuel standards so everyone in the value chain, consumers, producers, everyone in that value chain actually wins.
Yeah, I think, like I said, we're not actually a producer in this market, but we are in other markets. Right. And I know one of the things that's really important when we think about implementation here is ensuring that there's a predictable long-term view, economic view for people that are companies that are making investments, right? So it often takes up to a decade to even complete the investment. And often people look at a business case, or companies look at a business case that is 20, 30 years out. So it's really important to come up with something that we think that can work throughout political cycles, not on a 4-year cycle, but on a 20-year cycle. That I think will really help the industry to be able to adapt and know that they can invest in this for the long term. So that would be one thing, I think we could really focus on. And I also would say, whether it's even on the West states or also in other areas, like in the corn states, et cetera, I really have seen incentives work. So consumer incentives and industry incentives, right? Industry incentives make the economics turn for companies that are for profit and have shareholder returns to be thinking about. So incentives on that front work, but also consumer incentives. I mean, we're all energy engaged. That's why we're here talking about this. But the average consumer is not that energy engaged, right? They're really thinking about a lot of other things in their life, and they're on the go, and they want to stop and fuel up, and they want it to be affordable and reliable. So I think, what we've seen, for instance, in some of the E15 states, E85, consumers are driven by their pocketbook. So if we can also make it more affordable, then you've really got a winning solution. And that consumer demand is what we're looking for. We're looking to be led by what the consumer wants to buy.
I think that consumers being aware of their pocketbook is a multi-generational trend that will not ever disappear. Let's talk a little bit more about New Mexico before we wrap a little bit. The investment here that Shell is making, and doing roadshows with us all year. Why is Shell so invested in New Mexico's clean fuel standard?
I think we're interested in it across the United States and across the world, to be honest, right, for the reasons we've discussed. But it really does take the combination of government through legislation and incentives, the consumer wanting to make a change, and industry, stepping up and doing their part. So when we see government really wanting to make a change, I think it's a chance for us to lean into that. We have a lot of expertise, so that's what we bring to the table. I think if the combination of those three parties can come up with solutions that work for everyone, then we're really going to see some change, and we're really going to see us step forward into a lower carbon environment.
Yeah, and New Mexico being the first, non-West Coast state, right? That's a big deal.
A lot of people, I think, are watching, right?
Absolutely.
I think it's going to be a really good role model for what we could see elsewhere.
Absolutely. All right, so our last question for you today. What is your call to action for consumers, business leaders, policymakers tuning into this conversation?
I would just say, first and foremost, collaboration is key. No one part of this ecosystem can make this happen without the other pieces. So I think really being open-minded, looking for expertise everywhere, and seeing if we can put the best solutions on the table. And the other thing I would probably say is that I think it's important we keep in mind, we are all here in service of the general public. In my case, in the general motoring public, right? We're here for the consumer, and so we need to make it work for them. So I think keeping that and their needs kind of at the forefront of our mind will help us to create a solution that will be very successful.
And that'll make loyalty very sticky. So
yes, absolutely.
Barbara, it's such a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for your time. And thank you again to Shell for making today possible. We appreciate you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thanks all.
Welcoming back to the stage, Chuck McCutcheon.
So just to continue the conversation, let me welcome our next guest. She's the president and CEO of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, Missy Currier. So very broadly, how can oil and gas and clean energy coexist in New Mexico?
You know, when we first saw that question, I thought a lot about it, and it's a little bit of a softball, to be completely honest, because we're already coexisting.
Right.
As Secretary Kinderdine mentioned earlier, natural gas is so important to the transition. So many of our producers are using renewable energies to electrify the field as well as to move forward. And that's something I think a lot of folks don't always understand, is that oil and gas and renewables do work incredibly well together. And we're excited as we move further into the transition period for that to only increase.
Right.
There is an assumption that some people feel that it needs to be oil and gas or renewables without realizing that those things meld so well together. It's an all of the above energy approach, which will get us to a transition.
Yeah. Obviously, a big part of your job is monitoring all the vast amounts of activity in the Permian. And I've read where you've said that the Permian success in reducing methane emissions is a real model for the rest of industry. Can you sort of talk about that and sort of what are the lessons learned that other places can take from it?
Sure. We have an interesting combination of New Mexico of regulation and policy, as well as innovation and technology, that has allowed us to see a 26% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the Permian in only 1 year alone. By 2030, that's only going to continue to rise. And as innovation and as technology continues to improve, that is what is going to allow us to continue to be better stewards of the environment, which is what all of our companies are interested in doing. And the more our companies are able to do, that then provides two opportunities. The first, number one, we continue to be good stewards of the environment. And number two, it allows us to provide affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy options for the everyday consumer. And finding a balance between those two things is something that our companies work toward on a daily basis.
Okay, yeah. I did want to ask about state oil production. I guess it surpassed 2 million barrels a day in 2024, which was more than double the output in 2019. And that's obviously due to the greater well productivity. Is there any concern that that productivity is kind of maxed out, or do you still see more potential?
We see more potential for a couple reasons. We do recognize, of course, that this is a finite resource, and at some point the products will run out. But with that in mind, we've been producing in the San Juan Basin for over 100 years, as well as in the Permian for over 100 years. During that century, there were times that said that the two basins are depleted. But again, technology and innovation has allowed us to be better stewards to the environment as well as go get the products. I kind of envision it like a gondola. In the last few years, especially since 2020 in the Permian, as the technology's improved, we've seen an arc that went straight up like a roller coaster.
Yeah.
But now we're on a little bit of a nice long gondola ride where we will be able to continue that production and see the benefits of production both for the state and the global economy for a long time. Yes, the products will go away, but that won't happen for decades to come.
Okay. I wanted to turn to the legislature. Could you just talk very broadly about sort of your assessment of how things went in terms of the industry in this most recent session?
Sure. This was a very difficult session. You hear that all the time from folks that work in the legislature.
Sure.
They're all hard. And the one you're in is the hardest.
Right.
But now that we're out of it and looking back on it, we saw over 25 bills that would have directly impacted oil and gas and had a negative impact on the industry. With our current regulatory and political climate, there's sometimes an anti-industry feel. And so while we are very fortunate to continue to move industry forward and make improvements through the environment and other opportunities, what we're not doing well right now is diversifying New Mexico's economy.
Right.
New Mexico is a one-trick pony when it comes to our economy. Oil and gas is very proud to represent 49% of the state's budget. while we want to continue producing at high levels, we have got to find a way to diversify. And until our state is able to create a business climate that will attract other businesses here, it will be increasingly difficult to diversify.
Yeah. Turning to specific bills in the legislature, one was, the state has these national leading methane capture rules for industry, but I guess there was a bill that would codify those requirements into law, didn't pass. What's your sort of thinking about that whole methane capture issue?
So even though the law didn't pass, we are very proud to say that in a report from July 2024, 88% of producers in New Mexico had said that they had either met or exceeded the 98% gas capture rule. That is something that we should all be proud of, and we're very excited for that other 12%. I just did public math, that's insane. I hope it's 12, but that the other 12% will quickly get there. Just because you have a law doesn't mean that good things aren't happening in the field. So even though we don't have the law, those businesses are working every day to do better in that space. We will continue to work with the governor to see if maybe in her last session next year, if maybe we could get a bill passed. But if that bill does pass, we would hope that they would look at language that would allow for amendments, for example, for a pneumatics exemption, that if you don't have the electricity to your site, do you need to be capturing the 98% gas when you're then having to run generators to run the site to capture the gas? It's very confusing. So the more electricity and the more opportunities that we have in the field and more common sense solutions is something that we're really looking forward to work with the governor's office on.
Yeah, and that kind of segues into my next question, which was another bill that did pass, was the Strategic Water Supply Program. But unlike the earlier versions, it didn't address produced water. And it sounds like that's something that she's going to revisit, and you're going to probably revisit. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So as you know, our companies, especially in the Permian Basin, it requires a lot of water to drill. However, one misconception is that oil and gas companies utilize a ton of fresh water to do the drilling. That's a misconception, not true at all. In New Mexico, our companies use less than 1% of fresh water in the drilling process. The rest of that water comes from produced and recycled water. Knowing that there is so much water, we truly believe that science is showing that water can be treated to a certain level to be utilized in different ways. Maybe to cool a data center, maybe to water a golf course. We're not looking for that water to be utilized in your kiddo's swimming pool or to water your vegetables, but there are different sources where that water could be used. We often say here in New Mexico, of course, that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting
over, right?
And knowing that we don't have a lot of that water resources, finding new ways to utilize that water is something that New Mexico should be very interested in, as well as our companies.
Yeah, and you mentioned data centers. Can you just sort of give me your thoughts on, I mean, there's a lot of discussion now in Washington and elsewhere about, all the energy that they're going to be producing and where they should be located. And there's even been discussion of by the president of coal playing a role in this. What are your sort of general thoughts on that?
Well, if there's anyone looking to put a data center anywhere, we would love to have it in New Mexico for a lot of reasons. We've got really great land resources and lots of other opportunities that could move the state forward. However, one thing that some folks don't fully understand either about data centers or artificial intelligence is it takes a lot of energy to run those things. Natural gas is the cleanest burning hydrocarbon. It's also the most efficient and the quickest and oftentimes the cheapest. So to ensure that we're able to have the Googles and the Chat GPT and the data centers that we are very fortunate to live off of in a modern world, we need natural gas to power those. We can have other sources that will also power those, but then what about battery storage? All of those things. So natural gas is the easiest option right now, which, going back to your first question of how can all these energies work together, data centers and artificial intelligence are a great example of how energies work together to power the world.
Yeah. And so just to kind of wrap up here, I wanted to sort of ask you about, obviously, it's very difficult to predict anything, especially in this day and age, but looking at your crystal ball kind of 5 to 10 years down the road in terms of New Mexico's overall energy situation, I mean, what do you, what really excites you the most in that regard?
I think as Secretary Kinderdine also mentioned this, but New Mexico is abundant abundantly rich in so many natural resources, whether it's mined minerals, whether it's oil and gas. The sun shines all the time here. Lord knows the wind blows all the time.
Right.
And I am very excited for New Mexico to be recognized not only as a mecca of oil and gas development, but also a mecca of all energies. We can look to nuclear, we can look to hydrogen. There are so many options out there. New Mexico will not only generate and run the state, but it could power the entire world. And once we're really truly able to harness the energies that we have available to us, and as technology improves for capacity and storage, we will literally blow the world away with the energy that can come out of this state.
Great. So I just want to wrap up. We always try to address one fun thing. With Melanie, it was the last song she listened to. You're welcome to offer that as well, but I wanted to ask you, as a Carlsbad native, what else should people do and see there besides the caverns?
So I am from Carlsbad, New Mexico originally. I'm very proud to be. Of course, we're able to boast the WHIP site, which
Right.
you know a ton about, but that's not really a tourist attraction.
Right.
So would
Right.
encourage you to check out the Living Desert, Sitting Bull Falls. The river is fantastic. We're truly an oasis in the middle of the desert.
Right.
And not everyone will agree with me on this, but this is a hill I am willing to die. That the green chili is better below I-40 and the red chili is better above. So I would encourage you to have the green chili.
Fighting words, to be sure. So anyway, we're out of time, but we'll have to leave it there. But thanks so much again, Missy, for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Chuck.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Please give it up for Axios pro-energy and climate policy reporter, Nick Sobczak.
Morning, everyone. Great to be with you. I am Nick Sobczak. I cover energy and climate policy for Axios Pro. For our final conversation this morning, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage New Mexico Commissioner of Public Lands, Stephanie Garcia-Richard. Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you being here. As Chuck alluded to earlier, we have seen a great deal of change in federal policy over the last 3 months or so, to say the least. Proposals from DOGE to shutter facilities in New Mexico. We've seen some freezes in funds from the Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure law that I know, the state has taken advantage of for abandoned well remediation, among other things. Just be curious to know, what your experience has been so far in dealing with what you're seeing from the Trump administration and how you're sort of tackling that.
So I guess the first thing I want to say, people have been making a lot about everyone in this room knows each other. So in New Mexico, we are a very small state, so we are kind of an intimate energy ecosystem. Yes, we all know each other, we all go way back. I think that helps with public policy. But so in that vein, I wanted to actually start out by just thanking our federal delegation for everything they've done to really step up to protect New Mexico's public lands and public resources in this time of threats from the federal government. A couple of things that we've seen, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act money is very much in flux right now. We were using that to plug wells. At the State Land Office, we actually have our own enforcement and accountability program where we have taken lessees, particularly bad actor lessees, to task for their use of that public resource. We've successfully closed and properly plugged 650 wells, which is a very conservative estimate of saving the New Mexico taxpayers $65 million because that cost is not borne by the taxpayers of New Mexico, it's borne by the industry themselves. And so that's kind of on the low end. On the high end, we've had judgments against companies we've had to actually take to court and sue to the tune of $7.5 million for a cleanup of a site in one case. So while we do have those threats from the federal government, the New Mexico State Land Office is doing everything in our power to ensure that our state lands are protected.
Talk about renewable energy. You have helped oversee big growth in renewables on state land during your tenure, driven part by the passage of the New Mexico Energy Transition Act. Just given that federal landscape and other factors, I mean, what are the challenges to making sure that that continues, that the state meets its renewable generation goals?
Yeah, so unfortunately at the federal level as well, there has been a pullback on support of these large renewable energy projects. That really threatens all of the progress that New Mexico has made. So you've heard all of the other speakers, including the executive director of the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, talk about our renewable potential in New Mexico. I mean, that is real. I've heard solar developers talk about how our solar resource here is second to none in the nation. So what we have been able to do at the State Land Office, and again, just for folks who are not familiar, you can Google us, but it's basically an elected official that has oversight of 9 million surface acres of public land here in New Mexico. And we have increased renewable energy build out in New Mexico. We are saying sevenfold, almost sevenfold. So there was 400 megawatts when we first started. There are now almost 2,800 megawatts of renewably generated energy on state trust land. And then the second thing I would talk about in terms of renewable energy is our community solar program. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but our legislature passed a few years back an ability for local communities, tribes, rural communities in New Mexico, all very important places where people reside, to generate their own power. So they don't have to rely on large transmission lines. They can have locally generated power through the Community Solar Act. And we have 8 projects on state trust land that we are have approved and are getting ready to come online. And so that is a way as well for us to provide power and meet our carbon goals, actually, is really the bent behind that push.
How do you see the kind of balance between those types of projects and the sort of big renewables projects that are intended to export energy elsewhere? Like, SunZia is a prime example for this state, but I mean, what is that sort of balance in your eye of how that build out happens?
That's such a great question and really well phrased, because I see it as previous speakers have mentioned, not an either or, not an either or. It is a balance. We are building lots of transmission on state land. So you mentioned SunZia. The unfortunate thing about SunZia is it took, and there are folks in the audience here who have been working on this project for the 15 years it took to permit. We don't have that kind of time. The next SunZia can't take 15 years. So we have tried to do some things at the State Land Office. We are meeting with communities, showing maps early, talking about how we're protecting cultural sites, protecting wildlife, protecting habitat while we are building these large projects. Because, I mean, we have that flexibility to be able to use state land, be nimble with our permitting, but not damage the resource in the meantime. So that is the approach that we've taken. And so much so that when I first was running for land commissioner, remember this is an elected position, there were folks around the state, their biggest kind of association with the land office is, you all making your deals in the smoky rooms and in private. And so what I committed to do, and we ended up doing, was the very first year I was elected, the legislature passed a mandate on public meetings held in the area of impact, in the community of impact. So I was just in Roosevelt County last week to chat about a transmission line that's going there. And I think people appreciate it when you show up, that you are upfront with them about your decision making, that you are available to answer questions that they have.
That's a great sort of transition to the next thing I was going to ask you about SunZia specifically, but also the big picture of this, because I think, I'm in DC, and in DC policy circles, SunZia, among other sort of these large transmission projects, have become sort of a symbol of just the struggle to build this kind of stuff that we need if the nation is going to have an energy transition. You mentioned it took 15 years to permit. I think you rattled off a few already, but I'm curious, what you see as the lessons learned from SunZia for federal policymakers, state policymakers, local engagement with tribes, local governments, everybody that's involved with this. Like, how do you make the next one take less time?
Absolutely. So we're doing everything at the land office to ensure that we are prioritizing these projects and not have them be a decade and a half long to permit. I think one thing you did see with SunZia is, unfortunately, it felt as though the upfront consultation wasn't entirely thorough, because on the Arizona side of the border, what you saw with that line is the Native community saying, hey, like, you didn't have our consent, like, you know, we weren't part of this process. So all of that needs to happen upfront consultation, always. When you talk with tribes and Native communities, what they say is consultation early and often. So that is something that we stand by at the State Land Office. So that's one thing. Number two, really using state land where possible. State land is a lot more nimble in terms of the inspections we do, the site inspections we do on state land for biological and cultural surveys. We don't have that sort of prolonged process like you do on federal land with NEPA. And so I think using state land where possible is another kind of lessons learned on these particular build-outs. I will say that the State Land Office the New Mexico State Land Office, at least, is one of the few in the country that requires cultural surveys, requires biological surveys, but we are still able to get the projects completed.
Have you seen, on this front of consultation with locals, with tribes, have you seen any growth in New Mexico of opposition on the local level to renewables projects? There have been some stories about that around the country. I'm just curious if you're sort of seeing that at all, as these projects have in some ways become a little bit politicized because of some of the Trump administration's actions as well. So just curious if you've seen further local opposition or if it's sort of status quo.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. You do see some of that opposition that has unfortunately become political, and it's funny because some of the transmission we're building out, so I mentioned the line that goes through Roosevelt County we were just in to have a public meeting on. That line is not being built because of renewable energy. No matter what the energy source, even if we had carbon or fossil fuel produced energy, we would still need the added transmission. So kind of trying to piece out this sort of demonization of renewable energy from our true energy needs here in New Mexico. I mean, we need added capacity. Everywhere in this state, there is not a single corner of the state where we don't need added transmission capacity. So, trying to make it clear to folks that, like, we're not building transmission because of renewables. We are bringing renewables online, to create that energy ecosystem and meet our climate goals.
To turn back to oil and gas for a second, the governor recently signed a bill that you advocated to raise the state royalty rate for oil and gas. Could you just talk about the impacts of that, both for state and for industry?
I would love to talk about the impacts of that. So this is a bill, I don't know who's watching. So if you are familiar with royalty rates, essentially it is the privilege that someone pays the mineral owner to develop their minerals. Sometimes it's called a fee or a tax. It is neither. It is literally, the privilege that you pay to be able to develop someone else's minerals. In this case, the minerals belong to the people of New Mexico. And what we had heard for a very long time, we go to these conferences around the country, folks would say, oh, wow, you're capped out at 20% for your royalty? Do you know people in that same basin are getting 25% and upwards for their minerals? So we started this push 6 years ago to ask the legislature, because those rates are set in statute, to raise that royalty rate. Thank you to the legislature for passing that bill finally, and to the governor for signing it. But essentially what that means is, because that royalty money is not immediately spent, it is invested into our state investment, our permanent fund by the State Investment Council, which is now worth upwards of $60 billion, second largest in the nation. That will now go on to be invested and generate a further $1 billion to $1.5 billion in revenue just from that slight increase in royalty.
It's a big number.
It's a big number. We're talking in billions now, guys. Ba.
So on that front, in the big picture, this is something that has interested me for a long time, covering federal policy. What do you think is the future of the state's oil and gas industry looking ahead on a sort of span of decades here, like maybe 2050, particularly in the Permian Basin? The state, as you alluded to, gets a lot of money from this. It's a large driver of economic activity. Do you have to start thinking about replacing that at some point, or is it going to continue with the energy transition? How do you see that?
So I liked something that Secretary Kennedy said, which is that it will be a sequence. We are now in the kind of throes of that sequence, okay? We have been completely heavily reliant, and I'm talking revenue right now, I'm not talking about energy production to power folks' homes. We have been completely reliant for a long time on that 2 million acres we have of state land leased up in the southeast part of the state. And it's been a cash cow for us. I mean, you ask anybody whether or not they support oil and gas, they know it's been lucrative. As that begins to ramp down, or like Missy said, hit a plateau, we do need to look to other forms of diversification for our revenue, and we should have been doing this, quite frankly, about a decade ago. We don't have time on our side for this. I've always said that we're never going to replace the money from oil and gas development one-to-one with any other industry. I mean, it's just, we have a resource there that is world-class. And so, we will unfortunately will not be able to replace those billions of dollars one-for-one with any other diversification tool. But we should be looking at all kinds of diversification for our revenue in the instance where we won't rely on these historic revenue generation coming out of the Permian Basin. But the other thing that really keeps me up at night is like, what happens when those folks move out of that part of the state? Who's left holding the bag for any kind of use of the land, degradation of the land, equipment left behind? Our very next undertaking, now that we've gotten the royalty bill passed, is ensuring that we have proper bonding on all oil and gas development on state land in the southern part of the state. And I've got 20 months left in my term, and I hope to come out with some reasonable bonding rates in that time.
That answers my next question in part, at least, which is that you have announced a bid for lieutenant governor, obviously, and just what are your priorities outside of that as you wind down your term in this job?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of different things we want to just like put a bow on. And so the first one, obviously, is the bonding, and actually that's the largest one. We are working on a couple of large-scale affordable housing proposals on state land. We want to get those as close to the finish line as possible. We're looking at outdoor recreation on state land in terms of camping. So always in the past, we haven't really had camping on state land, and we'd like to look at ways that, what we're hearing is with the uncertainty, I'm just going to use the word uncertainty, of federal funding on our national sites coming down from Washington, we feel like our state recreational sites are really going to see an increase in visitation. We want to be prepared for that. And then we've got a couple of tribal land exchanges in the works. We are doing a lot of repatriation of tribal land back to tribes. And so we have a couple of those in the works that we're trying to get over the finish line.
Well, we have to wrap up, but as Chuck mentioned, we always do like to do one fun thing. And in the spirit of this is a long-running feature in our newsletter, what is the last song that you listened to?
Last song I listened to. I mean, I wish I had something like inspirational like Melanie. So I am all Lucy Dacus all the time right now. And like I'm about, I don't know, 30 years younger than most of her fan base. But I do believe it's important to listen to the next generation. So she's got this song, it's called Time Fighter. And it's like, I fought with time and it whooped my ass. And I'm like, shit. That's, like I don't have the advantage over time.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there. We're out of time. And thanks you all for joining us. It means a lot to us. And it's wonderful to be here in Santa Fe. I, too, have a little bit of history here. I've been here before, and I'm very happy to be back. Please feel free to refill your coffee on the way out. And one final plug, be sure to head to Axios.com to sign up for our various newsletters on energy and climate policy, including the one that I write, which is called Axios Pro Energy Policy. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you.